Hello and welcome to this Astranti video on sustaining success, and in particular we're going to be looking at how you can sustain success by managing the performance of your team and individuals within your team by using human resources processes. Now, as a leader of a team, you're going to be in a situation where you're in charge of getting the best out of the individuals on your team. And the individuals on your team are going to vary. You're going to have some who are motivated and they always hit their goals, but perhaps they're not particularly happy in the kind of work they're doing. You're going to have others who are always slow and they complain about the tasks that they're being set. They seem to find everything difficult. They hardly ever achieve their targets without someone else helping them. You're going to have others that are doing well, that seem keen and engaged, but perhaps they need a new challenge and you're not quite sure what new challenge you can give them to get their teeth sunk into. And you'll have others that are just doing fine. They're happy to get on with the work. They're content with the kind of work they're doing and you don't need to get too involved at all. So in previous videos, what we've looked at is the need to and the importance of setting personal objectives for the members of your team, covering things like behavioral issues, their particular role, development of skills and development of their career overall. And we've also looked at the importance of monitoring progress and how that is just as important as any other task related to team objectives. And an important part of that is continuous communication. Now, so far, we've mostly been looking at how you can do this as the leader of the team, how to set objectives and monitor the progress. But in organizations, there will be a human resources department, and you can use that human resources department to help you in these areas. Okay, so as you probably know, the human resources function of an organization is concerned with managing an organization's staff, and part of their role is to ensure that staff performance is evaluated and that necessary action is taken to manage that performance. So what we're going to look at in this video are a range of human resources processes that you can use relating to managing performance of individuals on your team and monitoring performance. So what we're going to look at are appraisals, first of all, how to use them, how they can be effective, some of the limitations of appraisals, and we'll also look at disciplinary action when that's appropriate and what it should be used for. So let's start by looking at appraisals, and I'll bring up a quote on the screen and I'll just give you a moment to read through that. Okay, so that's a great quote that captures the essence of a good performance appraisal, what it can do for the individual, for the team, and the organization. So let's unpack that a little bit to try and understand how you can make sure you're giving really good appraisals. So first of all, the basics. An appraisal is a private meeting between a team member and their direct manager. Sometimes other people may be involved as well, depending on the scenario. And the point of that meeting is to discuss the performance of the team member or the appraisee. Okay, so as a manager, it gives you the opportunity to discuss the performance of the team member over the past 6 months or 12 months or however frequently you have the appraisal. And in that appraisal, you're going to go through the appraisee's strengths and weaknesses. And the idea is to come up with a plan for them to continue to do the things that they're good at and a plan for improvements in areas that they're not so good at. You're also going to want to use an appraisal to get a sense of the individual's career and what their career plans are for the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And through having these appraisals gives you the opportunity to track and create plans that improve the long-term performance of the members of your team. Okay, so that's the basic idea of an appraisal, what it is and its purpose. And appraisals typically have a certain structure, and we'll go through that now. So before the appraisal even begins, you do need to do a bit of prep work. And effectively what you need to do is prepare the materials, so the report or the assessment or the information that details the performance of the team member over the past 6 months or a year. And you also need to plan the structure of the meeting, what you're going to cover, how you're going to bring up different topics and different things, and in what order you're going to do that. And then once you've decided on that, you need to inform the appraisee when and where the meeting is going to be so that they can then prepare for that themselves. And also at this stage, if they do need to do anything in preparation for the appraisal, such as a self-assessment, they need to be informed and told how and when they complete that, so that it's ready for the appraisal. That's before, and then you have the appraisal. And during the appraisal, you need to go through the main goals of what the appraisal is for. So you go through the strengths and weaknesses of the employee. Okay, and it may be that you start by asking them to come up with what they think their own strengths and weaknesses are, and you may add to that discussion with your own insights. Okay, and once you've discussed that, and again, the more you can get them to identify their own weaknesses, the more buy-in you're going to get from them. But once you've gone through that, you would then create an action plan with the team member, and you'll go through exactly how they're going to improve in the next 6 months. And it's important here that you include how you're going to support them in achieving those targets. And then the final part, giving the appraisee or the team member the opportunity to ask any questions or bring up anything that they want to talk about specifically before the appraisal ends. And then once the appraisal itself is over, the next step is really important, because if you don't do this, then it kind of makes the whole thing pointless. It's really important to follow up and monitor the progress of your team member after the appraisal. It's fine to have the meeting and you have this really great discussion where you identify areas of improvement and you come up with a really good action plan, and then you finish the appraisal and you don't talk about it again until the next appraisal. So that's entirely pointless. What you want to do is follow up and monitor their progress. So you might say set another meeting or a point in, say, a couple of weeks or a month, where you'll check in with that individual and see how they're progressing towards their appraisal targets. So as we've said in the past, it's really important that you provide your team and team members with continuous and regular feedback throughout the year on their performance. And it's also important that you give them guidance on how to improve using suitable performance measures. And the idea is that appraisals shouldn't have any surprises in them. It shouldn't be the case that after 6 months of work, an individual thinking that they've done fine comes into an appraisal and you unleash a whole load of problems and issues that that individual has been having. They had no idea because you hadn't communicated that to them in the last 6 months. Suddenly you're dropping it all on them in this appraisal. They're going to be a bit shocked and maybe concerned for their particular job. That's not what you want to happen. An appraisal really should be a summary of the conversations you've been having with individuals over the past 6 months, and it gives you an opportunity to have a more formal conversation about those things. And just to clarify, appraisals aren't always every 6 months. It might be once a year or it might be once a quarter. Okay, so if we're saying you should have this continuous feedback, then what are the benefits of bothering to have an actual appraisal at all? So first of all, having appraisals, it gives you that dedicated time for in-depth feedback, and you can analyze your team members' performance over a longer period of time. And that gives you a bigger picture or a broader picture of how that particular individual is developing in their role. And it puts their shorter term targets and perhaps some of their day-to-day tasks into a bigger picture for you to see how they are progressing. Appraisals also help to set agreed and formal expectations and targets for your team members' improvement. And by agreeing these targets, you increase your team members' accountability for their own improvement once those areas have been identified and flagged up by you as their manager. Appraisals can actually improve productivity, particularly if in the appraisal you are rewarding good performance with a pay rise or a bonus or a promotion. That reward will motivate the individual to seek to continuously improve in their role. Another benefit of appraisals is that it allows progress or potentially a lack of progress to be formally documented. And so you can track how well your team members are or aren't progressing. And you can use this documentation as evidence for any future decisions, either related to rewards. If you're looking to promote people, you can look at this evidence and say, well, this person has shown huge improvement over the last 6 months, so they're eligible for a promotion. And you can also use it as evidence for disciplinary action if needed. And we'll be looking more at disciplinary in the second half of this video. So those are the major benefits of appraisals, but of course there are some challenges with appraisals that it's worth being aware of. First of all, there can be challenges around delivering effective feedback, and here we're referring to if you need to give constructive criticism or negative feedback. That can sometimes be demotivating if it isn't given in a constructive way. If you have to give negative feedback in an appraisal and the member of staff wasn't expecting it, or if they feel that it's not going to be possible for them to improve in that particular area, then you're going to have a demotivated member of staff, and that's not what you want. So you need to put thought into how you're going to deliver feedback, particularly if it's on a weakness or a negative feedback that needs to be given. You need to make it constructive and focus on how that individual can improve. An important part, again, of appraisals is that you come up with an action plan for that individual staff, and that plan, those targets, need to be achievable. So you may need to think about how it is that this individual is going to improve in this particular area in a realistic way. When it comes to appraisals, you need to be very aware of any natural biases that you may have as a manager, biases that you may have about the performance of a particular individual. You need to also be aware of any potential biases that that individual may have about themselves and whether they tend to over or underestimate their particular strengths and weaknesses. Another challenge with appraisals, particularly if you only have them perhaps once a year, is going to be that the targets that you set may quickly become out of date. And so really what you need to do is to have an ongoing continual performance review, for example, setting weekly or monthly targets that are more up to date and more relevant, rather than just the set of targets that only come once a year and perhaps, like I say, become out of date quite quickly and aren't actually relevant after a month or so after the appraisal. And finally, one of the major challenges of appraisals, particularly if you're talking about giving appraisals for many individuals and lots of people being involved, simply the amount of time it takes. Appraisals can vary in complexity, but you can have appraisals that require you as the manager to fill in forms and do assessments of all the people on your team. You may also require them to do self-assessments, so you have to allow time for that. You then have to arrange the particular appraisal, when it's going to be and where, who else needs to be there, making sure that everyone's available at that time. You go through the appraisal itself, and then you have to come up with your action plan, and then you are following up with that with the monitoring and seeing how well the individual is achieving those particular targets. And if you're doing that for lots and lots of individuals within your team, or if you look at it from the perspective of the entire organization, it can be very time consuming. So you definitely need to put aside the time to plan appraisals, to make sure that they are done effectively, and to make sure that you don't rush through them just to get them out of the way, because they are a very important part of the progress of the individuals on your team. So there are two main types of appraisal, and honestly it's going to probably be determined by your HR department, but we'll just go through them now so you know how they differ and the sort of pros and cons of each different one. So you have 180 degree appraisals or 360 degree appraisals. And starting with 180 degree, here you have 2 points of view. You have the employee, who will evaluate their own performance. They'll do a self-appraisal of their performance. And you have the manager's point of view. In this case, that'll be you. And you will be discussing and providing your own view on that employee's performance over the period that's under discussion, whether that be 6 months or a year. Okay, so the member of the team, first of all, gives their assessment on how well they think they've done in the past 6 months, say, and then you will discuss that with them and give your own insight into how you think they've done, and together you come up with some next steps and points and targets to achieve for the next appraisal. So why might your organization be using 180-degree appraisals? Well, first of all, it means that your team member is involved in the review process, and it gives a more rounded view when it comes to appraisals because you're getting input both from the employee and from that employee's manager. And it gives the employee a chance to reflect on their own performance, and therefore they feel more responsible and more involved in the actual appraisal process and monitoring and looking at their own performance. Another reason to use 180-degree appraisals is that you as the manager can give a full explanation of the feedback. So the employee does their own self-review and then you provide your insights on their performance. And so every point of discussion you can fully explain and answer any questions about because it's your own analysis and you understand why you've said what you've said in that particular performance review. And that also makes it easier in terms of tracking performance after the appraisal. And you can see whether the individual is improving because you're the one that has provided that initial assessment along with their own self-assessment. And as we'll see in a moment, this is one of the major points of difference between a 180-degree and a 360-degree appraisal. So what are the challenges when using a 180-degree appraisal? Well, first of all, as we've already discussed, one of the major issues is going to be the time required to carry out the appraisal. You need to set aside an appropriate amount of time for planning, for carrying out the appraisal, for doing the self-review, and for you to do the review of the employee. And you also need to put time aside to follow up on progress. Another challenge you may find with 180-degree appraisals is that it can lack the perspective of others, particularly other members of the team that the individual works on, or perhaps other members from other parts of the organization that the employee regularly works with. Those points of view aren't going to be included in a 180-degree appraisal because remember, it's just the employee and you as the manager. But to mitigate this to some extent and to try and get some broader perspectives, you could ask other team members or other teams how they feel your team as a whole is working, and then you could provide that feedback to your appraisee. And with that, since we're talking about other perspectives, we'll move on to look at a 360-degree appraisal. And the key difference here is that the individual is receiving feedback and being reviewed by multiple range of sources. So a 360-degree appraisal will include a self-appraisal where the individual appraises themselves, but it will include perspectives from colleagues that the individual has worked with, their managers, maybe bosses higher up in the organization. If it's the review of a manager who leads and manages people, then getting the input from their own subordinates. And in some cases, particularly in sales or customer service, you're going to have some perspectives from customers where available. So a 360-degree appraisal is going to be more in depth, and you're going to incorporate a much wider view of perspectives. So the benefits of this approach, why an organization might choose to use this, is because the team member can compare their own view to this range of other views. And that may enable them to identify strengths and weaknesses that they didn't come up with or they weren't aware of themselves. And only by considering the feedback from others do they get a full picture of their actual performance within the team and within the organization. 360 appraisals also provide a non-managerial perspective. It's much more diverse than a 180 appraisal, and you have more than just the manager's perspective. Managers typically only observe certain aspects of an individual's performance, and having these wider views, as we say, gives a more well-rounded view and probably a more accurate review that isn't just through the lens of the manager. And so you might get a better idea of things like how well the individual works within a team or how they communicate with other members or customers or things like that. Okay, so going into this appraisal, if you have strengths and weaknesses of the individual that come from colleagues and managers and bosses, subordinates, you'll have insights and you may be able to discuss things with the individual that you may not have come up with between the two of you, as in a 180-degree appraisal. But there are, of course, challenges with a 360 degree appraisal. First of all, it can be difficult to analyze the qualitative feedback that is coming from these different sources. A lot of the feedback that you get will be opinions based rather than quantitative. And so as a manager, you need to use your judgment to interpret this feedback fairly. That brings us on to another challenge, is deciding whether the reviews are even trustworthy in the first place. If you've received feedback from colleagues, that colleague may be a friend of the individual that you're appraising, and they may be unwilling to be overly critical and maybe mostly give positive feedback. And the opposite is true. You may have had feedback from one customer who had a particularly poor experience, and they're giving a lot of negative feedback on this particular individual. So you need to decide whether that is representative of that individual generally, or whether that was just a one-off and isn't indicative of their general behavior. So as the manager in a 360 appraisal, you need to use your judgment to interpret that feedback and provide constructive feedback to the people that you are appraising. Another challenge is that you may find yourself focusing too heavily on the negatives because you've got a lot of feedback. There's a great deal of volume and breadth of information coming in. It can be easy to focus mostly on the negatives and the areas that need to be improved. And so as the manager, you need to ensure that strengths and other positive feedback are actually drawn out of the insights that you've got from all these different sources, and that they are passed on in the appraisal. And one final challenge is selecting the suitable people to give the feedback. You may be unaware of who it is that your appraising works with regularly, and so you won't know necessarily who to go to get valuable information. You may end up going to people who perhaps don't know them very well, and they're giving vague or general feedback that isn't particularly useful. So to overcome this, you could ask the person you're appraising to come up with a list of people who they think would be useful and could give valuable information with regards to their performance. Okay, so those are the types of appraisals, the challenges and the benefits of using them. And more broadly, this is what appraisals look like. So you'll be doing this usually in conjunction with the human resources department, and they can obviously be used as a way to have these conversations with the members of your team to discuss their performance and to create plans to help them improve over their career.